Welcome to this special episode of the Danger Close podcast. Over the next few weeks, I'll be answering listener and viewer questions about the novels in the lead up to the publication of Red Sky Mourning, available June 18th, 2024. Will there be spoilers? Absolutely. Be sure and stay tuned after the Q&A to listen to Ray Porter read the prologue. This episode of the Danger Close podcast is brought to you by Bravo Company Manufacturing. All right, The Devil's Hand. Here we go. Q&A. Thank you to everybody who sent in questions. These are awesome. Absolutely love answering these and sincerely appreciate everybody taking the time. This is from Instagram from Archer Baxter Adventurer. I thought your question in the preface of your book, The Devil's Hand, was interesting. My question is, what is your understanding of the conflict that we were engaged in for over 20 years? So I think the question that I pose in the beginning of The Devil's Hand is about, not really a question, it's about understanding the nature of the conflict in which you're engaged, which is one of the primary responsibility of those who send young men and women overseas into combat. And understanding the nature of the conflict in first Afghanistan, then Iraq, seemed to have escaped those senior level military leaders and politicians. And there's a lot to this question, and I talk about it quite a bit in the blog section of my website. If people go to that blog section, officialjackcarr.com, and then scroll through the blog to find the couple of posts that I did when the U.S. left Afghanistan in August of 2021, I'll go more in depth in there. But for this, understanding the nature of the conflict in which you're engaged, it comes back to that and drawing lessons from the past. And if we look at Afghanistan in particular, we had the Soviet experience, and we were not so far removed from that. We were only a decade removed from the Soviet experience in Afghanistan, from say 1979 to 1989. We had British incursions into Afghanistan. You didn't even have to go back to Alexander the Great or Genghis Khan. So you had all of this history to draw from to start understanding the landscape, the people, the history, the culture, and understanding how they embrace even their enemy when that enemy asks for sanctuary, essentially. So there's all these factors that were at play, all these examples that were out there, yet we still went over, and in what I like to think of, I don't like to think of it, and what I think of as imperial hubris, we committed forces that in very small numbers, and we did not listen to the people on the ground, particularly in Tora Bora in December of 2001, that needed to block off escape routes into Pakistan. Those went essentially ignored. When we had Rangers, we had Marines, 10th Mountain Division, that could have performed that task and essentially prevented what happened over the next 20 years, certainly over the next 10 years until we got Osama bin Laden in 2011. So there was a lot to understand about what's going on over in Afghanistan. Senior level leaders went in front of Congress over and over again, asking for more troops, more money, more, and their progress reports sounded something like our host nation forces are making progress, just need a little more time. So we really drew out this conflict in Afghanistan, focused on poppy seeds for a while, the poppy crop, because we thought that was funding terrorism. There's a lot at play here. People should read the Afghanistan Papers by Craig Whitlock that goes into this, and he juxtaposes what senior level military leaders were saying in front of Congress and then what they were saying in what they thought were going to be classified histories of the war. So the Afghanistan Papers is definitely an eye-opening read for people that want to become familiar with what was going on over there. So a lot to that question right there, but officialjackcarr.com, the blogs from August of 2021 should give it a little more insight into to my thoughts on what happened over there. All right, here we go. Instagram, Carson.Blakely. What was your research process for this book? Was it impeded at all by the pandemic? Would you be interested in sharing a guide to researching for any aspiring authors? So the research process for this book, luckily, this book was mostly continental United States based. And some of the places that, or at least one of the places that I describe in the book, in Iran, I couldn't really get to. But I was lucky that most of the places that I was going to have to describe, in thinking about it pre-pandemic, I'd already been to. So, of all the books, other than the first one, this was the one that, I didn't really have to go somewhere to research. Of course, then the pandemic hits and, things change for everyone. So in this particular case, I am looking at lessons learned. And I started off with what the enemy, and the enemy could be, when you think of it in those terms, could be, Iran, China, Russia, North Korea, a super empowered individual, a terrorist organization. But for those people, institutions, countries, intelligence services, militaries that had 20 years to watch us in Iraq and Afghanistan, I thought, what would they have learned? If I was the enemy, if I was one of those entities, what would I have learned by watching the United States in Iraq and Afghanistan in particular, and some other places around the world as well? What would I have taken away from that, and what would I have applied to my future battle plans? What would I have learned? And so that was the premise for The Devil's Hand. Of course, as I start writing, the pandemic hits, and I see our response to that. I see our response to COVID, and I think, well, the enemy is certainly watching this as well, and they are watching our response to COVID. So that became very natural for me to incorporate then into the novel real time. Then we move into the summer of 2020, which is when I'm writing The Devil's Hand. And I see this summer of civil unrest. And I think, oh, well, the enemy is certainly watching this, and they are taking lessons from this and figuring out how to exploit this division. And then we move into a very contentious election season. Once again, the enemy's watching all of these things. So as I was writing real time, things were developing that I incorporated into the novel. So it was a very interesting time to be writing a book that happened to have that premise. But before the pandemic, I'm already writing a book here, essentially about a pandemic, about bioterrorism, and about bioweapons and bioweapons research. So I'm researching that, well before, let's see, what COVID hit in, let's say, January, February, March timeframe of 2020. Well, I'm already researching and writing The Devil's Hand well before that. So it was very interesting and very timely that I was writing that book when COVID actually hit. So, would you be interested in sharing a guide to researching? I think research is going to be different for everyone. And for me, I know I'm not going to be able to go a lot of times to every place that I'm writing in a book if someone's hopping around the globe, but I can pick places sometimes where I've already been. So I try to do that as much as I can. And of course, today with the internet, you can do a lot of research online. You can go to travel blogs and see other people's experiences in some of these places. So I do that. Of course, you can zoom in on Google Maps or Earth, that sort of a thing. So I try to do a lot of that. My plan was always to go to one of the main locations that I'm going to talk about in the book, but that I haven't been before. That's going to play an important role. So that hasn't always happened, because next book, I wanted to go to Israel. And I thought, oh, for sure, I'll be able to go to Israel by the time I'm doing that research. But those pandemic restrictions, especially for Israel, if you were not an Israeli citizen, it was very difficult to get in and out of Israel during the time that I was researching and writing that section of the next novel of In the Blood. So I think the research is going to be different for everyone. It's all what you're comfortable with and what you're writing about, and how much of that you can do online. And for me, sometimes it's very important to go places. So for this next book, I don't want to give away too much, but I'll be going someplace to do some boots on the ground type research. So it's going to be different for every book and for every author. The Sig Sauer P365X Macro. Slim and easily concealable. Patented 17+1 capacity magazine. Choose from a 3.7-inch barrel or a compensated 3.1-inch barrel. Expansion chamber slide reduces muzzle rise by up to 30%. X-ray 3 sights for precise sight acquisition, day or night. Nitron coated finish. The Sig Sauer P365X Macro. The choice of James Reese and me, Jack Carr. Let's see here. From X, this is Whiskey Tango 2. Nice. Spelled WISKEY_Tango 2. Well played. And he asks, what do you think our enemies viewed that day in August of 2021 pull out from Afghanistan? And interesting, in the first book, I think in the first chapter, so not in the prologue, but in the first chapter, I talk about an old Afghan saying that the Americans have all the watches, but we have all the time. And that was something I thought about while I was over there. And I like to ask the people that we were working with if they were older, if they were the right age, if they were mujahideen in the 80s against the Soviets. I was always very curious about their experience, because a lot of people only knew war from very early age. So in talking to the people that we were working with, and listening to their stories, and one in particular in the back of a Toyota Hilux truck, I remember thinking, as he was talking to me about his experience with the Soviets, that wow, someday we're going to leave this place. And this guy's helping us. He's in the back of a Toyota Hilux pickup truck with me right now. And when we leave, and back then, that was 2003. So I thought in 2001, if you weren't in Afghanistan, a lot of us thought we missed it. And obviously that was not the case. So in 2003, I thought that we would be out of there in a year, another 2 years, something like that. But I knew whenever we left and I knew we would eventually leave, because this is expeditionary counterinsurgency. So a counterinsurgency on domestic soil is much different than an insurgency that you do off your native soil. So expeditionary counterinsurgency is what we were doing. Very difficult to do, especially so far removed from your home, not even bordering your home country. So I thought, we're going to leave this place eventually. What's going to happen to this guy? And what's going to happen to his family? And that was in 2003. It took a lot longer than we thought, but I think about that a lot. I think about all those people that helped us, and then what they do now. But also history and culture in Afghanistan, very interesting how we tend to look at different cultures through our own lens here in the United States. And loyalty is very interesting over there, because when you switch sides to the winning side, in many cases that's looked as natural, because you ask that question, well, why did you switch sides? Well, that other side was winning. It's that's how some of the people over there look at it, or at least that's what some of them expressed to me. So it's very interesting, very different than our concept of loyalty over here. And when you think about it for a second, about where they are and what they're doing in their history, it's fascinating. So, Americans have all the watches, but we have all the time. All right. From Facebook, and this is from Mike Watkins. What are your thoughts on the U.S. developing pathogens like the one described in the book, and on the contradiction of the Bioweapons Convention? And so The Devil's Hand is the first book in which I write an author's note at the end. And all the books have a preface at the beginning that kind of sets up what's to come. And then for this book in particular, I thought that people were going to have a lot of questions about what was true and what was not, after what they had just read. So it's the first time that I put an author's note in, and I put an author's note into the back of every book since. And, part of that was because of this question right here. What was true? What was not? What do these conventions mean? How do you get around these conventions? And I talk a lot about that in the book, but if you read, it's fiction. So when you get to the end, people might wonder what's true. So I talked about that in the author's note to The Devil's Hand, and I've done that once again in every book since. But it's very interesting how the United States and other countries get around these being signatories to these bioweapons conventions, and developing biodefense weapons, which means that you have to have the actual pathogen, you have to have the actual weapon to figure out your defense to it. So it's very interesting. And yeah, once again, in the author's note to the book in a little more detail. And that is it for The Devil's Hand. Thank you so much to everyone who wrote in questions. I absolutely love doing this. And next episode, I will dive into a Q&A from In the Blood. And you can stay tuned after this to listen to Ray Porter read the prologue to The Devil's Hand. Go to officialjackcarr.com. Check out the new merch there. And until the next time, take care out there. Stay safe. Be strong. Keep fighting.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
This is another type of warfare, new in its intensity, ancient in its origin, war by guerrillas, subversives, insurgents, assassins, war by ambush instead of by combat, by infiltration instead of aggression, seeking victory by eroding and exhausting the enemy instead of engaging him.
Tonight, I can report to the American people and to the world. The United States has conducted an operation that killed Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda.
Subversion in Soviet terminology means always a destructive, aggressive activity aimed to destroy the country, nation, or geographical area of your enemy.
The Devil's Hand, a novel that explores the lessons our enemies would have learned from watching us on the field of battle over the last 20 years and how they would have incorporated those lessons into their battle plans. The fourth novel in the James Reese Terminal List series.
Prologue. For those not involved in the operation, the day that changed the world started no differently than any other. For a select few, there had been a slight variation to their routines. Alia Hajar was one of those few. For the past year, Alia had been employed by Jet Clean Industries, a commercial janitorial service specializing in aviation, cleaning planes between flights at Boston's Logan International Airport. She spent her days working her way up and down the aisles with the rest of her cleaning crew, picking trash out of seat back pockets, restocking the lavatories with toilet paper, disinfecting the galleys, and arranging the seat belts. Alia did not mind the work. It gave her time away from her home, where she could talk with the other Muslim women assigned to her rotation. It was also time away from her husband. He had never struck her when they lived in Hamburg. The beatings had started once they moved to the United States, after receiving their 5-year business visas from the embassy in Berlin. At first, Alia thought it was because she had failed to bear him children. Now, she knew differently. She had not understood why the man who had studied to be an accountant in Germany was bussing tables and cleaning the kitchen at a Moroccan restaurant outside Cambridge. Their meager take-home pay barely managed to cover the rent and put food on the table of their small Watertown apartment. The first time she pressed him on the subject, he slapped her across the face. Even now the memory of the sting, compounded by shock, caused her eyes to water. When she attempted to turn and run, he grabbed her by the throat and threw her onto their second-hand couch that reeked of mildew, squeezing the life from her as he screamed that she was not to question him again. Later that night there had been a knock at the door. Her husband had pointed to the bedroom and told her to stay there until he came to get her. Pressing her ear to the door jamb, she strained to hear the short, hushed conversation. She recognized her native tongue, but could not make out the words. She then put herself to bed and pretended to sleep. The next day, after work, she searched the small apartment and found an unfamiliar suitcase in the broom closet by the entrance. It was filled with cash. She tried to put it back exactly as she had found it. That night, he beat her again. This time, it took a few days for the swelling to go down. When she did return to Logan International, the hijab hid the marks, her bloodshot eyes all that were visible between the black slits. From then on, she never touched an unfamiliar suitcase, backpack, or bag found in the apartment. She knew it was hawala, the ancient system of money transfer originating along the Silk Road. It allowed for the movement of funds around the world without the digital trail left by banks and wire transfers. Hawala ladars usually took a percentage of the transfer for their trouble, yet Alia noticed no perceivable change in their finances. As a Muslim woman with a strict Islamic upbringing, she was barred from knowing the specifics of their financial situation. She just knew the couch was moldy and her husband took no steps to replace it. 2 weeks ago, she'd returned home from work a little earlier than normal. She had not been feeling well for a few days. As she fished the keys from her purse, she fumbled and dropped them in the stairwell. Had the man coming down stopped to pick them up, smiled, and wished her a good day, she would have thought nothing of it. Instead, he passed by without acknowledgement, his foot stepping within an inch of the keys. He was slightly older than she was, though not by much, and was unremarkable, except for one notable feature. It was his eyes that haunted her. Empty. Even though it was the height of the summer heat, she felt a chill. Perhaps she really was coming down with something. No, she thought. I've seen him somewhere before. Hamburg, Cairo, somewhere. As she pushed the cleaning cart onto the plane docked at gate B32, she wondered if the man with the empty eyes was involved with this evening's mission. Her husband had called in sick to the restaurant, which Alia thought was odd because he was clearly not ill. Yet she accepted it, as she did so many other things in her life. The violence had taught her it was best to not ask questions. Then he told her Allah had chosen her for an important task. Now she understood. She understood why they had applied for business visas in Germany, why her husband had taken this menial job in the United States, why they prayed only at home and did not frequent the mosque, and why she had been forced to apply for the minimum wage job cleaning airplanes. The Boeing 767 was scheduled for a morning long-haul flight to Los Angeles. It needed to be cleaned the night before so it would be ready to go the following day. She adjusted her hijab and knelt, using the blade from her box cutter to scrape gum from the deck. Disgusting. She and the other janitors on her crew had been taught to use the short steel edge to remove bubble gum from the underside of seats and from the floor of the aircraft they were entrusted to clean. It was standard industry practice. What wasn't standard industry practice was what she did next. She had intentionally maneuvered into a position in first class where she could track the positions of her colleagues. 2 were picking their way through the seat backs of the main cabin, filling garbage bags with refuse from the last flight of the day. 1 was sanitizing the aft lavatory. A supervisor was perched mid-cabin overseeing their work while marking complete boxes on a checklist. Pretending to notice something across the aisle, she moved to the second row and knelt. When she stood back up, box cutters were taped to the underside of seats 2A and 2B. As their chauffeured town car slowly worked through the morning New York City traffic, Alec Christensen heard the familiar Nokia tone chiming from the new phone in his messenger bag. He fished it out by the third stanza. Tilting the device toward his fiancée in the seat next to him, he smiled, showing off the new caller ID feature. You were on that thing too much, she scolded. It's going to give you a tumor. Hey, Dad, Alex said, after hitting the large talk button with his thumb and bringing it to his ear. Just about there. Oh, really? That's too bad. Okay. Then I'll meet you at the Rainbow Room. Yep, 8:30. I'll let her know. See you then. What did he say? Jen asked. He had to move our breakfast to Midtown. A meeting at the office came up, so he can't make it down. He said to send his deepest regrets, Alex said, switching to the mid-Atlantic accent so heavy in his father's voice. "You sound like Julia Child." "Oh, come on. That was at least a good William F. Buckley." "Want to try and swing breakfast with us?" Jen looked at her watch. "Well, my boss is coming in late today. He's dropping his son off for the first day of kindergarten. Even so, I'd better not. I don't think I'd make it back in time." "Are you going to tell him without me?" Jen said, switching topics. "What do you think?" Alec asked, as his thumbs went to work on the small keypad. "Why don't you just call? This new texting thing is just too weird. I don't see it catching on. And besides, you're missing this beautiful day, not a cloud in the sky. These tech guys like it, and it's actually pretty efficient once you get the hang of it. See, you just have to scroll through these letters until you find the one you want. Just letting the team know I'm on schedule to meet them at 11 at the property on 8th. Think your company is going to buy the building?" "Probably just lease part of it for now, but you never know. This bubble is going to burst, Jen. It's not going to be pretty, but the companies that survive are going to emerge stronger and gain a huge amount of market share." "I love it when you talk dirty to me," Jen said, sliding across the back seat of the Lincoln, closer to the man she planned to share her life with. It would have been faster to take the subway into Lower Manhattan, but when Alec was in town, his father always provided a car service. Jen suspected it came from protecting his only child. It broke her heart that Alec had no memories of his mother, who passed away before he could even crawl. "How long do you think the meeting will take?" she asked. "Probably a couple hours. I want to go for a run when it's over so I can think it through. It's a big deal for the company, and I want to make sure we are doing the right thing. How you run in this city, I'll never understand. I grew up doing it, so it's totally normal. Well, you be careful. I worry about you running around these streets. It's dangerous." "Well, it's not as safe as doing sprints on campus at Maloney Field, I'll give you that, but trust me, I'm a professional." They had met as undergrads at Stanford, but were now 2 years removed from Cardinal Red. Alex had played lacrosse and liked having had the advantage of growing up in the East when it came to a sport still catching on across the country on the left coast. When he met Jen, he instantly loved everything about her. After graduation, he had elected to join a small, struggling Silicon Valley startup founded by fellow Stanford alums and was taking payment in stock options like almost everyone else. Unlike everyone else, he had a trust fund that kept him from living off ramen noodles. Jen had been offered a fantastic opportunity at Cantor Fitzgerald and was just beginning her 3rd year as an investment banker. She was planning to apply to Harvard Business School and start classes next fall, a move Alec's father fully supported, in the hopes it would lure his son back to the Atlantic seaboard. They had been engaged for the past 2 months. Alec had wanted to wait to tell his dad in person. He was sensitive to the fact that the man who raised him had done so alone, the love of his life succumbing to cancer so early in their young lives. His father had never remarried. Alec had planned to tell him that morning at Windows on the World with Jen by his side. "You know what?" Jen asked before answering her own question. "It's better this way. You two boys have your special moment together, and then I'll let him spoil me at dinner." "Where do you want to go? I'm sure he'll ask." "It's Tuesday, so how about the pool room? Dad is more of a grill room guy, but for you, I'm sure he'll make an exception." "Are you sure I should tell him without you?" She put her hand under Alec's chin and twisted his head away from his texting so she could look into his eyes. "I'm positive." "Hey, Dad." "Right on time, lad," his dad said, looking at his Patek Philippe. "I still set mine 5 minutes ahead, just like you taught me," Alex said, pointing to his left wrist. "That way I can be 5 minutes late and still be on time." "That wasn't really the point, son. The point is to be early. It's disrespectful to be late, shows you don't treasure our most valuable asset, time," Alex said, completing the sentence he'd heard from his dad so often over the years. "That's right." "See? I do listen." "Mr. Christensen," the maitre d' interjected politely, "your table is ready." "Thank you, Charles." They were seated by the giant windows of the iconic New York restaurant. The Empire State Building dominated the view south towards Soho, Greenwich Village, and the twin towers of the World Trade Center. Lady Liberty was even visible in the distance on such a clear day from 65 floors up. Alex smiled, picturing Jen grabbing a bite in the lobby of her building. Maybe she had gone ahead with breakfast at Windows on the World by herself before heading to her desk and was looking uptown toward him, right at this very moment. Dobson Christensen was dressed impeccably in a dark three-piece suit. Not a single gray hair out of place. His tailor did an outstanding job of disguising the fact that he was not in the best of shape. Like many of his generation, exercise consisted of walking the links at Maidstone and the occasional trek afield at Clove Valley Rod and Gun Club, both of which consisted of equal parts business and pleasure. Alec's usual Sand Hill Road attire of khakis and a blue button-down had been accented with a dark blue blazer and tie. He dressed more formally in New York out of habit, having grown up dining with his father in places that would not approve of the more casual uniforms that were the norm in Palo Alto. His father placed a white napkin in his lap with great ceremony as a waiter set down a French press. The senior Christensen was a regular. "For you, sir." "I'll have the same, please," Alex said.
"So, tell me about the future of the Internet," Dobson said. "And don't leave out the parts about where I should invest other people's money."
Dobson Christensen was a bit of an anomaly. While most with money and means had sheltered in place in the world of academia to avoid the Vietnam War, Dobson had taken a different path. He dropped out of Princeton and volunteered for the Marine Corps. Years later, he'd say he did it to just
get it over with.
But Alec knew better. Behind the suit, polished shoes, and country club exterior was a fiercely patriotic man who could have volunteered for stateside National Guard duty or qualified for a student deferment, but instead was drawn to the fight. He found himself as a door gunner on a Huey gunship, which was shot down on its first mission before he could even fire a shot. The pilot and co-pilot were killed, but Lance Corporal Christensen survived with a broken back, pelvis, hip, and femur. He spent the rest of his Marine Corps experience recovering, first in Okinawa and then at Walter Reed. His cane and limp were a constant reminder, and when asked about it, he would say that his Purple Heart was a VC marksmanship medal. He liked to joke that he spent more time in boot camp than in Vietnam. The waiter returned and handed menus to both men. Dobson put his aside, saying,
"I'll have the Forestier omelette and a side of your thickest bacon."
He wasn't one for wasting that most valuable of assets. I'll have," Alex said, scanning his choices. A sound he could only associate with a freight train barreling by at full speed shook the room. Stunned patrons gripped their tables, bracing themselves for what some thought was an earthquake, even though their left brains were telling them that couldn't be true. Alec looked to his father, whose eyes were focused southeast. Alec followed his father's gaze and stood, pressing his hands and face to the glass. He watched the plane descend from across the Hudson into the city between the buildings. Veering toward its target, it disappeared into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. Fire, smoke, carnage, death. "Jen!" Alex sprinted for the elevator. "Come on!" he shouted. He glanced at the stairwell and contemplated the option, but forced himself to wait, knowing the elevator would still be the fastest way down. Most people were glued to the windows watching the smoke rising from the North Tower, so when the elevator doors opened, Alec was alone. "Please, God, let her live. Let her be in the lobby. Just let her live." Fighting back the bile in his throat, he pressed his eyes shut, willing the elevator to descend faster. Where did that plane hit? He knew Cantor Fitzgerald occupied floors 101 to 105, and that Windows on the World was perched atop the North Tower. "Come on! Come on!" The doors parted, and Alec launched himself through a group of businessmen unaware of the disaster unfolding just a few miles south. He hit the street at a full sprint. Turning toward the subway, he stopped and looked at the steps leading down, then back toward the dark smoke invading the blue sky over his beloved city. He made his decision. He ran. Sprinting toward the smoke and the flames, he dodged those not yet aware that the world had changed. Heart pumping, lungs burning, his legs propelled him forward, tearing through intersections oblivious to the honking horns and the cursing of those he knocked over in his mission. Sirens. He'd always remember the sirens. As the mortally wounded building loomed larger, he pushed past people stumbling in the opposite direction, some in a panic, others in a daze. He began to charge by police officers and firefighters yelling at him to turn around. He then heard the screaming engines of what he would later learn was United Airlines Flight 175 as it homed in from the south. He felt the impact in his soul. 2 planes. He had to get to Jen. Dear God, let her be all right. He thrust himself forward, closer to the broken glass and twisted metal, toward the jet fuel burning its way through the steel heart of the structure. He ran toward the dead and dying. He ran toward bodies plummeting from the sky. He ran toward Jen. He ran toward hell. Sit, her husband commanded. Alia sat, the stale smell of the couch on which he'd first choked her filling her nostrils. They had already completed Fijr, their morning prayers, he in the main room and Alia in the bedroom. Islam forbids men and women from practicing the second of the 5 pillars of Islam together. She'd performed wudu with water from the bathroom sink as he did so from the kitchen, ritually washing the body, mouth, nostrils, hands, arms, head, and feet. Though not purified water, as prescribed in the Quran, they were on enemy soil, and Allah would forgive them this one indiscretion. Instead of adhering to Salah that morning, she had sat on the bed and looked through the small, dirty window, listening to her husband recite Quranic verses in Arabic. They spoke Farsi in the home, but true adherents to Islam prayed in the language of the Prophet. She entered the main room only after she heard him finish and turn on the small television. They watched CNN in silence. When the first plane hit, she remembered. She remembered Mohammed Haidar Zammar from the Al-Quds Mosque during their time in Germany. She remembered his hatred of America. She remembered his incessant talking. She remembered the hard floor and paint peeling from the walls of the women's prayer room, and she remembered the man with the empty eyes. Though his picture would not be plastered across television screens around the world for a few days, she remembered where she had first met the man in the stairwell. She remembered him sitting down with her husband in their Hamburg apartment. He was soft-spoken, almost aloof, paying her no attention. She had made them tea. They had talked about planes. His name was Mohammed Atta. We have triumphed over our unjust enemy, her husband said, without taking his eyes from the screen. Praise be to Allah for this victory, she replied dutifully. This, he said, pointing to the billowing clouds of smoke coming from what, until that moment, had been a symbol of America's economic might to the rest of the world. This is only the beginning.
Until the next time, take care out there, stay safe, be strong, keep fighting.